They say he laid his cloak over the mud for a queen, but no velvet could shield him from what came next. On the scaffold, the poet-warrior knelt in the damp morning air, his breath soft as scripture, his eyes locked not on the heavens, but on the crowd. Those who once drank his words now waited for the sound of the blade. His hands, once calloused from sword and quill alike, trembled only slightly as he touched the block. The axe was freshly sharpened, his neck already bared, and yet he spoke of death as if it were a lover delayed. This is not just a tale of Sir Walter Raleigh's end. It is the tale of a man who rose by ink and charm, by conquest and myth, only to be devoured by the very court he had once seduced. A man who built empires in the name of loyalty, but whose blood would soak the stone courtyard at the command of those he once served. He wasn't executed for treason, at least, not truly. He was executed for memory, for being too visible, too legendary, too hard to erase. When kings inherit power, they also inherit enemies, and some of those enemies come wearing medals and writing poetry. So, how does a man go from kissing the hand of a queen to kissing the blade of an executioner? What secret wars rage behind the golden curtains of monarchs? What price must be paid for brilliance when it burns too brightly for the new king's comfort? This is not a story of rebellion, nor of betrayal. It is a story of survival denied. He had sailed to the New World, hunted the mythical El Dorado, charmed Elizabeth I, and inspired generations with his wit. But by the end, he was a prisoner with a pen and a death sentence older than his final crime, a T, and in that irony lies the horror. Because Raleigh did not die once. He died slowly through exile, through whispers, through royal silences. His last execution was just the formality, but before the axe fell, there was a dream, a vision of a kingdom reborn, a letter, a voyage, a betrayal, and a king who needed him forgotten. To understand his death, we must first understand the crown he served, and the one that turned against him. He arrived at court, not with the noble birthright, but with the fire in his eyes and thunder in his tongue. As a Devonshire son of modest beginnings, Walter Raleigh was no heir to great estates, but he was something rarer, clever, relentless, and cursed with charisma. In an England that devoured ambition and spat out bones, he made himself indispensable not by blood, but by brilliance. He spoke with the rhythm of a poet, fought like a soldier, and flirted like a courtier whose words were dipped in honey and steel. He studied law at the Inns of Court. He fought in France for the Huguenots, sailed with pirates, but it wasn't until he returned to the Elizabethan court scent touched, sea-worn, and soaked in rumor that his rise began. And when he first knelt before Queen Elizabeth I, something shifted in the air. She was the virgin queen, powerful, unattached, commanding, surrounded by men who craved her favor like addicts. But Raleigh was different. He didn't grovel. He dazzled. With every letter, every jest, every whispered verse, he positioned himself as more than a servant. He became her confidant. Favorite. He didn't just serve the queen, he entertained her myth. It was Raleigh who carried the stories of the New World to her ears. It was Raleigh who dared to envision an English empire in the West, rivaling Spain's gold-stained grip. It was Raleigh who named Virginia in her honor, promising an untouched Eden across the seas, with her as its spiritual queen. The court buzzed. He wore pearls. He strutted in embroidered cloaks. He wrote love poems that hid political messages. He brought back tobacco from the Americas and turned smoking into an aristocratic ritual. He wasn't just powerful, he was fashionable. Nobles scoffed, but envied. Statesmen warned, but listened. And Elizabeth gave him land, titles, command of fleets. In 1585, he became captain of the Queen's Guard. His enemies whispered that no man should hold that much sway. But Raleigh knew how to walk the line. He never asked for her love outright, but offered her eternity in metaphor. He mastered the alchemy of presence and distance, intimacy and duty. He was her knight of smoke and gold, and in that golden hour he felt invincible. But glory in court is a tightrope soaked in oil. And the higher you rise, the more hands reach to cut the rope. The queen was aging, the empire growing fragile, the future uncertain, and Raleigh was playing with fire. He had tasted the height of favor and wanted more. But ambition is a greedy guest. It does not dine alone. In 1591, Sir Walter Raleigh did something unforgivable. Not treason, not theft, not war crimes or heresy. He fell in love. Her name was Elizabeth Throckmorton Bess, one of Queen Elizabeth's own ladies-in-waiting. Young, bright, and burning with the same dangerous charm, Raleigh wielded like a sword. Their love was not the coy poetry of courtly flirtation. It was real, physical, risky, and it was secret, because Elizabeth, the queen, could not abide rivals, not even romantic ones. She ruled as the Virgin Queen, an icon of chastity and unattached rule. Every woman at court was a shadow cast by her light, and every man who adored another dimmed his loyalty. But Raleigh didn't just flirt. He married Bess in secret, without royal permission, a violation of court law, loyalty, of personal insult. When word reached Elizabeth, it was not the betrayal that broke her, it was the audacity she had made Raleigh, lifted him from mud to marble. And he repaid her by hiding a wife in the shadows of her own palace. The punishment came swiftly, like a queen's mood changing with the wind. Both Raleigh and Bess were thrown into the Tower of London. Imagine it, the once glorious captain of the Queen's Guard silken, eloquent, lion-hearted now, pacing in a cold stone cell, stripped of his rank, his titles, his access to the Queen's gaze. The courtiers who once bowed to him now whispered behind fans. The Queen who once treasured him now turned her face to others. His world collapsed not with a war, but with a wedding. And when he was finally released, something had changed. I.e., still walked with pride, still wrote poems, still smoked his beloved pipe. But there was a bitterness now, a burn behind the eyes. His greatest mistake hadn't been loving Bess. It had been believing he could serve two queens. They let him go, but they did not forget. The tower gates opened, but the court doors stayed shut. Raleigh returned to a world that no longer needed him. His rivals had crept in during his absence. Robert Cecil, the cold genius of politics, and the rising tide of younger favorites who knew how to flatter without fire. He had once glittered. Now he glimmered like a dying star. But ambition does not sleep. Raleigh turned his gaze west to gold, to empire, to El Dorado. If he could not reclaim favor at home, he would carve a kingdom abroad. In 1595, he led an expedition to Guyana, claiming he had found a city of unimaginable wealth. His account was poetic, persuasive, cade, and full of fiction. He described golden cities and majestic rivers with the flair of a bard, not a mapmaker. The Queen, still aching with betrayal, allowed him the fantasy, perhaps amused, perhaps hopeful. But others saw through it, especially Spain. Raleigh's voyage had poked a bear, violating fragile peace treaties. And even if England smiled in public, enemies were waiting. Then came the Queen's death. Elizabeth I, his greatest protector. His most complicated enemy died in 1603. Her throne passed to James I, a monarch with no love for Raleigh, a grudge to settle. It didn't take long. Raleigh was accused of conspiring against the new king. Whether he had truly plotted or merely spoken unwisely remains blurred by the fog of court politics. But in the eyes of the crown, he was a traitor. His trial was a farce, a theater of bias, Evidence was whispered, not shown. Witnesses were cited, not summoned. Raleigh, ever the orator, defended himself with brilliance, but it did not matter. He was sentenced to death, but the execution was delayed. James, the cautious and calculating, commuted the sentence. Raleigh was returned to the Tower once more. 13 years. 13 years behind cold stone and iron bars. Former knight turned phantom, and yet, even there, he wrote, he planned, he dreamed. But dreams are dangerous for a man the crown once forgotten. And when Raleigh emerged, old and stiff, in 1616, the world no longer looked like his. He came out of the Tower like a ghost wearing skin. Walter Raleigh was no longer the gallant courtier who scattered cloaks for queens. His frame was withered, his hair gray, his joints stiff from cold stones and colder years. But the fire remained in his eyes, in his pen, in the reckless conviction that he could still rewrite his fate. And the king, ever the schemer, saw an opportunity. James I gave Raleigh one last mission, another voyage to Guiana. The prize, the gold Raleigh had once promised, the mythic El Dorado. The catch, he must not provoke Spain. War was not on the crown's menu. Raleigh agreed. He had no choice. But El Dorado was no city. It was a mirage that had already cost him his youth, would now take his life. The voyage was cursed from the beginning. His son, Wad, accompanied him. Bright, impulsive, proud, he would die on that expedition shot in a skirmish with Spanish forces after Raleigh's men attacked a settlement, violating the king's strict command. Gold was not found. Glory was not gained. Only blood, and when Raleigh returned to England, there were no parades. Only politics. Spain, furious, demanded justice. And James I, the ever-anxious puppet of diplomacy, offered Raleigh's head, not for what he had done recently, but for the treason charge still lingering from years before. They dusted off the old sentence. No new trial or defense, just the execution delayed too long, now reinstated like a final insult. Raleigh understood. The court no longer needed his brilliance, only his silence. But in those final days, he did not plead. He wrote, he smiled. He faced death like an old friend who had taken too long to arrive. His body had failed him, his son gone, his empire undone, his name poisoned, but his words, they lived. In letters, in poems, in a gallows speech that would outlive his enemies. He walked to the scaffold with poise. Let us dispatch, he said. At this hour, my ague comes upon me. I would not have my enemies think I quaked from fear. He laid his head down. The axe fell. The court exhaled. A legend ended, but not quietly. The morning of his death was damp. London's sky hung low like a shroud. At the foot of the scaffold, the crowd gathered, not out of sympathy, but out of appetite. They wanted spectacle. They wanted the fall of a man who had once kissed queens and colonized continents. Sir Walter Raleigh arrived, not as a traitor trembling in chains, but as a philosopher in flesh. Dressed in a fine black suit with a satin doublet and lace collar, he cut a figure, not of disgrace, but of dignity. Time had grayed his beard and stooped his back, but he walked with the same certainty he once held in court. Not arrogant, not afraid, prepared. He greeted the headsman with calm civility and inspected the blade. This is sharp medicine, he murmured, but it is a physician for all diseases. Those gathered waited for fear, for trembling, for begging. They received poetry. He addressed the crowd, not as an accused, but as a witness. I die in the faith I have lived. I never had any other religion than that of the Church of England. His voice didn't falter. His hand shook. It was from the fever, not from fear. Then he knelt. The block was soaked with old blood, cold to the cheek. Someone offered him a blindfold. He refused. I have a good face, he said. I will not hide it from death. 3 times he adjusted himself against the wood. 3 times he placed his head with deliberate care. Strike, man, strike, he whispered to the executioner, who trembled more than the man about to die. And then the axe came down once, then again, and again. It took more than one blow. It always did. The crowd went silent. It wasn't the death they expected. Not a criminal's cry, not a traitor's fall, but the quiet extinction of a mind they once feared, and a reminder that even empires must kill their own prophets. His head, once kissed by queens, now rolled in the straw like a butchered relic. They held it up, as was custom. Behold, the head of a traitor. Keen, but many in the crowd did not cheer. Some wept, others simply stared, not because they agreed, but because they had seen something rare: a man who met death without disguise. Man who left this world with wit sharper than the blade that ended him. They did not give Sir Walter Raleigh a hero's funeral. There were no royal guards, no eulogies in marble halls, no music save for the shuffle of feet and the whisper of scandal still clinging to his name. They buried him quietly in the floor of St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. No monument, no statue, just stone and silence. But even in death, he remained a threat. His body was interred, but his head was not. According to legend, it was embalmed and placed in a red velvet bag by his widow, Elizabeth Throckmorton, for the rest of her life. Some say she kept it beside her bed. Others claim she carried it with her as she wandered in exile, the head of her beloved, a relic of love and vengeance. Truth or tale, the separation was symbolic. They had severed his body from his legacy, but not from memory. 4 years after, his name was spoken only in caution. A man too curious, too ambitious, too clever for kings. He had walked among the giants Sussex, Cecil, even James, but outlived none. And unlike others, he didn't fall by sword or scandal, but by being too inconvenient for the crown to tolerate. The very explorers who followed his maps spoke his name in whispers. Raleigh's ghost sails still, they'd say, in the jungles of Guyana, in the wind over Roanoke, in the failed colony that bore his dream. England remembered him in fragments. To some, he was the traitor who mocked the law. To others, the jet lover who dared court a queen. And to a few, he was something worse, a reminder of what happens when the mind rises higher than the throne allows. His writings were quietly republished, his poetry rediscovered. His vision of an English empire was no longer treason, it was prophecy. But they never gave him justice, no pardon, no apology, just silence. And so he was buried twice, once by the executioner and again by history. But graves are rarely permanent, and legends are rarely quiet. They tried to kill the man, but they could not kill the myth. Sir Walter Raleigh, the courtier, the poet, the pirate, the prisoner, became something far more dangerous in death than he ever was in life. An idea, a ghost tethered not to stone or bone, but to the ambition of a rising empire. For centuries after his execution, England would grow into the very dream Raleigh once scribbled in his tower cell. Colonies sprang from maps he helped draft. Explorers quoted his prose. Politicians invoked his name when calling for expansion, conquest, destiny. They called him a martyr of exploration, a visionary of new worlds, a man who saw what England could become long before she dared to look west. Ironically, the very crime for which he was killed, his obsession with El Dorado, would come to be seen not as madness, but foresight. Gold did flood Europe. Empires were built on the back of discovery. The jungles he wandered became the battlegrounds of power for centuries to follow. But not all legacies are grand. There was also the shadow it left behind. Raleigh's fall whispered a lesson to those who followed. No matter how favored, how brilliant, how essential you may be, your life is not your own when it offends the throne. Genius, when unchecked by obedience, is a crime. And loyalty, once bent even slightly, will break under the crown's weight in many ways. He became the patron saint of the disillusioned. Writers loved him for his rebellious tongue. Romantics mourned him as the doomed lover. Revolutionaries admired the way he smiled at death, unbending to the very end. But the monarchy? They never quite knew what to do with him. Too dangerous to celebrate, too famous to forget. It would take centuries before Parliament would begin to properly honor his contributions. His reputation shifted in waves straighter: patriot, fool, prophet. A man resurrected again and again by changing times, and through it all, one thing remained certain. He had carved his name into the empire, not with a sword, but with a sentence in life. He sought a golden city. In death, he became part of one. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not collapse as the axe came down. Instead, Elizabeth Throckmorton, once a lady of the Queen's bedchamber, now the widow of England's most infamous traitor, stepped forward with a quiet, practiced grace, and when the executioner offered her what was left of Sir Walter Raleigh, she took it, not with fear, not with rage, but with the resolve that would haunt London for years. Wrapped in velvet, she carried his severed head away from the scaffold. Witnesses stood in stunned silence. Some whispered of madness, others of devotion, but none could deny the horror of it. A noblewoman cradling her husband's head like a relic, as if it were still capable of speech, of love, of vengeance. She kept it with her for days, weeks, years. Some say she embalmed it. Others say it was stored in a red bag and hidden inside a cupboard at West Horsley Place, where she retired in mourning. No matter the truth, one fact remains: she would not let him go. Not truly, because to let go of his head meant letting go of the cause, the injustice, the betrayal. Elizabeth had loved him in secret, married him without the Queen's permission, endured exile, disgrace, and imprisonment at his side. And now, after watching the state reduce him to a body and a charge she'd see made a simple, chilling decision, she would remember what they wished to forget. She preserved him literally as a symbol of what power cannot erase: loyalty, love, and loss turned into protest. Their son, Carew Raleigh, grew up with his father's head nearby. It's a constant reminder of ambition punished, of courage ended not by defeat, but by decree. And yet, even as it decayed, that head spoke louder than the king. It asked, what kind of world destroys its visionaries? Spout justice slices away the mind of a man, then buries his truth beneath silence. Elizabeth never remarried, never gave interviews, never publicly pleaded for sympathy. She simply waited, carried on, and kept the velvet bag close. When she died, they buried her beside Sir Walter, but no record confirms if the head was ever laid with the body. Some say it vanished. Others claim it still lies hidden, sealed in stone, passed down in secret by those who understood its meaning. What is certain is this: the state took his body, cubed his mind. On the eve of his execution, with the tower's damp breath clinging to the stone, Sir Walter Raleigh did not beg. He wrote, ink, not blood, would be his final act of rebellion. His last night was quiet, but within that silence, he summoned every ounce of the eloquence that once made queens swoon and kings tremble. He penned letters, some to his wife, others to friends, and at least one that was never meant to reach the court, a final testament not just of love or regret, but of warning. In his own words, Raleigh wrote, "It is death I have chosen to look upon with a steady eye." This was not a man broken, it was a man disillusioned. He had played their games of empire, of flattery, of courtly masks, and now saw their cost. His letters warned of the vanity of power, of monarchs who reward betrayal and punish vision, of countries that worship the crown more than the conscience. To Elizabeth, his beloved Bess, he wrote, not as a romantic but as a prophet of sorrow. "Give my heart to the Lord and my love to thee," he began. But the message between the lines was sharper than the blade that would meet his neck. He spoke of a nation obsessed with control, of false alliances, of ambitions traded like coin, and of how quickly a man's worth turns to dust when politics shift. He did not ask her to forgive those who killed him. He asked her to remember the truth behind the lies. One letter, smuggled to a fellow prisoner, read more like a political treatise than a farewell key. In it, Raleigh dissected the New World Order forming around James I, the king he had once tried to serve, but who ultimately viewed him as a threat. Raleigh saw what others refused to admit, that the age of explorers was ending, that the crown no longer needed visionaries. It needed pawns. His execution, he believed, was not a punishment for treason. It was a message. This is what happens to those who think too loudly. And yet, even in the face of erasure, Raleigh clung to one thing: language. In that cell, he became the historian of his own demise. Words were all he had left, and so he made them bleed. Centuries later, historians would pore over his letters, not just for what they revealed about his trial, but about the soul of an empire built on denial. His scribbled margins and unfinished sentences, a picture emerges not of a man defeated, but of one who understood that legacies are not built in palaces, but in the quiet corners where truth is written down, even when no one is listening. He ended one of his final letters with a line that outlived every decree, every royal command, every executioner's blade. "I am still the same man, though in other clothes. They took his title, they took his lands, they took his life, but they could not take his voice. They say his head fell cleanly from his body, that the crowd gasped, then dispersed. That his widow gathered the severed thing, placed it in a red velvet bag, and kept it by her side for the next 29 years. That death for Sir Walter Raleigh was final. But the whispers say otherwise, because some deaths are too loud to stay buried in the years that followed. Strange tales circled the taverns, libraries, and court halls. Some claimed they saw Raleigh escape in disguise, that the body on the scaffold had been a stand-in, a sacrifice offered to silence the masses. Others swore his ghost walked the halls of the tower at night, pacing, not in pain, but in protest. But the strangest rumors weren't about his body. They were about his mind. Historians found fragments of work and finished manuscripts, coded writings, philosophical fragments that appeared after his death, writings that seemed too forward-thinking, too dangerous, too subversive for his time. And yet, in Raleigh's style, with Raleigh's voice, was it possible that he had arranged their publication after death? That he had staged not a rebellion, but a resurrection? One story, told in hushed tones, suggests that Raleigh had left behind a Cipro literary map encoded within his historical writings, pointing toward truths the monarchy dared not let surface, that he buried secrets within the folds of empire, and that his execution was not about justice, but about silence. Because what is more dangerous than a man with a sword? A dead man with ideas. He had written of El Dorado, of lost cities, of riches beyond imagination. But maybe the greatest treasure he left behind wasn't gold, was doubt. Doubt about kings, doubt about history, doubt about whether we ever know the truth behind the noose. Even now, some believe his spirit lives on in England's national, and is a lingering voice of conscience, a reminder that beneath every empire lies a graveyard of the inconvenient. Did Raleigh die that day? Perhaps his body did, but his defiance ain't. That was just getting started. They called it treason, but what they feared was not his sword, it was his voice. Walter Raleigh was not executed for what he did, but for what he represented. A man who stood too close to power without bowing. A thinker in an age that preferred obedience. A mirror held up to monarchs, reflecting not their glory. Pit, because Raleigh was many things. A poet, a pirate, a prisoner, a seducer of queens, and a scapegoat for kings. But above all, he was a man who refused to play dead while living, and for that, they killed him. His final act, stepping calmly toward the block. Folding himself down with dignity was not a submission, it was a warning. A final, living symbol of resistance, carved into the memory of a nation that prides itself on silence. And what did they gain by silencing him? Did the empire sleep easier? Did the monarchy feel more secure? Did history forget? No. In killing him, they wrote him into legend, turned a man into a martyr, a trial into a tale, a death into defiance. And centuries later, we still whisper his name, because some executions don't end a life. They ignite a legacy, and Raleigh's is a fire that refuses to go out.